Oh, good. Reporting is in progress. Got it. And no attempts to help them sort of like shift their mindset were making any difference. And I said, is it your perception that if you stop being sad about the thing, then you basically have disconnected from that person? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, okay, well, I can see now why you're rebuffing all attempts to feel better, because it doesn't, to me, it means you feel better, but to you, it means you've given up and ended, and means something very different, right? So when we're talking about eating, drinking, drugging, any of these things, again, we're not saying that's what that is. We're saying it could be showing up as that. And if all we're looking for is cuts and burns and those kinds of things, we might be missing some like really obvious that are not obvious forms of self-injury. Body modification, right? Again, this is really culturally rooted. And so it's not about, oh, they got a tattoo, they're into self-injury. We're going to talk about it later, but like, we should be curious about the context of the tattoo and the second tattoo and the third tattoo and so on, if that's the case. And maybe it's nothing. Maybe they just, they wanted to get this thing to remember their mom and that's it. But sometimes it's more than that. Yes. Oh, exercising is another one of those things that's sort of like socially acceptable. You wouldn't know what to look at me now, but I have a history of trail running and sort of like extreme kind of trail running. Like I love elevation. It's painful, right? And there are many documentaries about why do ultra runners do that, right? Why torture yourself? And often they'll say, just to see what I've got, right? See what I've got inside me, see how strong I am. And maybe that's part of it. And I think maybe another part of it is that some part of them wants the pain for another reason. Again, not saying everyone who exercises to the extreme is really just a masochist, but they might be. Now this one is similar. I would say it's probably the least obvious form of self-injury, and that's depriving. So like depriving specifically like of care from others or even from yourself. So let's say you have a cut on your hand and it's painful, and you could, and not that you've cut yourself, but it just, it happened. You could treat it, but you don't. Almost like part of you wants to feel that pain, but also in a non-physical way. I was talking with some clients about it, like being in a place of what I would call cozy self-loathing, where I'm sort of dwelling and wallowing a bit, just enough to make me feel good, feeling bad. You might be able to relate to that, where you're feeling down and people are trying to help you feel better and you don't want them to, for some reason that maybe you don't even understand yourself. You're sort of like pushing away, or you're really hungry and someone says, would you like something to eat? No, I'm fine. And we can look at that as like, oh, that's, social anxiety, it's attachment wounds. Yeah, it could be all those things too, but it might also be some part of you is getting something from feeling that hunger pain, and it doesn't want to stop that. So the real like crux of what I'm going to be presenting you today is how do we talk with people about what's happening to help us and them have a better understanding of what's happening, because our understanding will lead to how we respond to it, right? So why are some obvious forms of self-injury and some are less obvious? It comes down to the cultural context, right? What is culturally acceptable? And so if you think of like the cultural context, well, what I'm referring to is the meaning of a behavior that's determined by the norms of the culture. Now, culture exists on many levels, right? There's North American culture, and then there's, Mennonite culture, and then there's layers of culture. There's a culture within my own current family, my family of origin, my religion, my neighborhood, my country, my skin color, we belong to many cultures, right? And in some cultures, things mean one thing, and another they might mean something very different. So the cultural context is super relevant when we are working with and assessing how to work with self-injury. So here's an example. You can imagine if a little, a 12-year-old white girl showed up to middle school having done this to her face. I'm thinking the counselor might get called, right? But where this girl lives, what's like, man, that's awesome. Who did that for you? I want to book an appointment, right? It's very, very different. And, there's so many examples of it, right? These things that are like, they didn't just like 3D print those on her face. It's painful. It's a painful process. This is a painful process that happens. That's a painful process. Pain is involved in it. But the meaning of it within the culture is relevant, right? So instead of just rushing straight to, wow, they're doing this to their body because they're hurting, they're sad, they're angry, they're depressed, they're suicidal, just take a step back, assess what culture, or more accurately, cultures, does this person exist within, and how might this look within those different cultural contexts? Which sometimes we know because maybe we share some of those cultures, or we've just learned about them. And sometimes we might need to ask some questions of the person about, do your friends all do this? Oh, okay. So that's now telling me something different, right? Those are some examples. Now I include this one. It's the one bloody picture in the whole thing. And this guy is a professional strongman competitor. And he's doing deadlift, which is basically just taking the bar and lifting up as much weight as you possibly can off the ground. And he's been lifting so hard in this competition that he's got a nosebleed. Now, in most cultures, regardless of what that culture is organized around, having a nosebleed is not seen as a positive thing. But in the subculture of powerlifting and strongman competition or strength competition, it has a meaning to it. It means that you have pushed yourself to your ultimate limit. And I was recently watching a strongman strength competition called the Arnold Classic, and it was the first year that they didn't actually included female competitors. And so one of them, I think she did her deadlift, and she was in first place. The interviewer pulls over and says, "So how do you feel about your performance?" She said, "I got the nosebleed. I came in here wanting," it was like the weight she lifted, irrelevant. First place, irrelevant. She got the nosebleed. That was the goal because she had pushed herself that hard. Now, if I was a powerlifter in the past, I get it. But if you're not, you might be thinking, oh, what is wrong with that person? How is that a desirable thing? But it's what it means that is what is desirable. It's not the blood itself. It's that I was willing to go that far. I reached my absolute limit. That means I am whatever, fill in the blanks, right? But now the context of this is that he is an athlete and he's in competition. And maybe it is just an extreme mindset that's required to be successful in those kinds of competitions, but it might also be something else, right? So the idea of a social construct. One of the things I love to do with clients, because I just like to do it all the time anyway, is take a thing that we all just accept as a thing and wonder, why do we all just accept that as a thing? How did that come to be, right? Like, why do we shake hands instead of shrugging at each other? I talk with my wife, we're watching a movie that people start kissing. Like, isn't that weird? Like, who are the first humans who thought, I really have feelings inside me. I think I'm going to push my mouth on yours. And you're like, how did that even come to be? Right. And how did that become to be normal? Like, and if you're from a different planet and you get dropped down and you see people kissing, you'd be like, what are they doing? Like, I don't understand that. Right. And one of the ways this came to me one time was when we were at the lake with my friends, and their dog it kept finding these dead fish on the shore and like rolling around on these dead fish. And I was like, why do dogs do that? Right. So I'm like, well, Google will know. Pray to Google and it will answer your prayer. So I Google, why do dogs roll on gross stuff? And some people were like, well, it helps them leave their scent and mark their territory. And someone said, maybe they don't think it's gross. And I was like, oh yeah. If dog Google was a thing, they'd be like, why aren't the humans rolling on the fish? I don't understand. Do they not know what they're missing? Right. So that's a social construct of what is gross, what is normal. Because it's kind of like accepted, we don't know that normal means agreed upon. And I had a client who went to court. He wasn't on trial. He was a witness. He was actually the victim. And he came out of court, and he's quite an intelligent dude. And he said, today I learned that the truth is what everyone says it is. Right. And I think, yeah, that describes humanity, not just our culture, right? That because we're all in apparent agreement of a thing, that thing is a norm, and not even a norm, but considered the right thing. But that doesn't hold, right? So when we say that social constructs are built upon bias, what I mean by that is not discrimination and prejudice. The word bias is a French word that means shortcut, or it means diagonal. And so when you've got a square, right, and you need to get from this corner to this corner, you travel along the bias from one corner to the other corner. It's a shortcut. Bias are cognitive shortcuts, and social constructs are built on these cognitive shortcuts, because it's more energy efficient to read a situation using shortcuts than to look through every situation as an individual situation and think, yeah, but what about this one specifically? That's not efficient. But so we use bias all the time, but it often sacrifices effectiveness or accuracy. So a good example of that, right? We have two women here who are dressed very differently from each other, each with the same thought, almost, right? The one on the left, everything covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture. And the one in full coverage saying nothing covered but her eyes. Right? And both of them feel I'm right. Those people over there doing it weird, right? That's not the right way. And to them, it is not just a norm, but the truth. And so when we are interacting with people with something like self-injury, this is what I'm trying to encourage us to do. Like, okay, recognize that the feelings that you have, how you conceptualize it, is totally influenced by things outside yourself that we don't realize are influencing us. People will love to say, no one can make you feel anything. It's like, well, yeah, they can. That's what advertising does. It convinces you to buy stuff for reasons other than you think. Right? Why did I buy it? Because it was red. Why do I think I bought it? Fuel efficiency. Not really, right? So this is just sort of a reminder of how to think outside the box. You're familiar with The Emperor's New Clothes, the story. If you're not, these con artists basically trick the emperor, saying that they're using invisible, this linen is so fine that only truly intelligent people can see it. Now, he can't see anything, but rather than admit that he can't, because that would mean that he's not intelligent, he says, oh yes, it's beautiful. And so they're pretending to sew this garment for him in this but it's actually nothing. But everyone else who comes in, he says, look at this, isn't it amazing? It can only be seen by intelligent people, and rather than be seen as unintelligent, they all agree, yeah, oh yeah, it's amazing, to the point where he's now parading naked in front of his people, and everyone's just going along with it because no one wants to be the person who's too dumb to see these fine robes, until a little kid's like, why is he naked? Because he doesn't care, right? He's not been brought up enough in the culture yet to care about whether people think he's dumb. So he points out the obvious. And then it gives other people license to go like, oh, okay, so you don't see anything either? All right, I'll realize nobody sees anything because it's not there. Now, that's, to me, it's such a good example of how cultural constructs are formed, because it's not just about what the majority of people think. It's also about what some important quote unquote people think, what influential people think. So if I'm part of a peer group at school, and the peer group as a whole doesn't see self-injury as a certain way, but the leader of that peer group does, they have sort of inordinate influence on the rest of the peer group that makes it a norm. But maybe nobody actually wants to be doing it, but we all do it because we all do it, right? So the default lens, or the cultural context, it attaches value to what we are seeing. And stories, when I say our lens, it's the lens through which we notice. Stories, narratives arise because they deviate from what we expect, right? So if I told you, oh, guess what happened? This morning I was getting low on gas, so I got gas. You'd be like, that's the worst story I've ever heard. Like, why did you bother telling me that? But if I tell you that I was running low on gas, so I went to the gas station was out of gas. Oh, really? Because that's not usual, it's unexpected. And so if we come to see self-injury as normal or not normal, it will lend itself to whether we even notice that it's happening, right? So if you take an example like drinking, I remember there was a campaign years ago on Instagram, and it was this young woman, and she was posting pictures, I think, every week of traveling to different places around the world. And so she's posing there in front of some famous landmark, and a little caption about the trip. And at the end of the year, it was revealed that she's not a real person, but that in every picture she was holding an alcoholic drink, and that nobody noticed that in every picture posted for a year, she was drinking. And the purpose of the campaign was to show how these things happen right in front of us without us noticing, right? Now, if a person had a different cultural lens, say they belong to a religion that prohibits drinking, they would have noticed that on the first one, right? If someone belongs to a different group that celebrates drinking, I didn't even notice it. Like, what do you mean she's got alcohol? That's not alcohol. This is alcohol, right? She's got a little wine glass. What's that? Right? And not only that, but what we notice and how we value it comes with built-in sort of explanations for why, right? So with that particular person, seeing pictures of her on holidays with a glass of wine, my cultural norm says, well, yeah, when people are, wealthy enough to travel the world and they go to nice restaurants, they have a glass of wine, right? But that might not actually be the explanation at all, but it's automatically supplied for me by my brain because of what I expect to be going on there. When I say that these cultural constructs come with built-in assumptions and corollaries, what I mean is there are assumptions about what the thing means. So when we're talking about self-injury, the common assumptions about self-injury is that it is an indicator of suicide or suicidal ideation, or that it's attention seeking. Oh, they're just trying to get attention, or they're really crazy, like because only like seriously mentally ill people do those kinds of things. And the corollary refers to how we respond to that assumption. So for each of them, if we see it as clear evidence of suicidality, clearly they need to be hospitalized because they're not safe. If we see it as attention seeking, in a bizarre twist of culture, we choose to ignore it, which to me, I get, but also makes no sense, because if it's like that, your child is hungry. Yeah, but if I feed them, then they'll just want to eat again. Like, we wouldn't hopefully say that, but we do that with people needing attention. I'm going to come back to that one a little bit. Or if we see it as serious mental illness, we might feel like, oh, this is beyond my scope. I can't help with this because this person is truly mentally ill and I'm not a psychiatrist. So they probably need some sort of medical intervention, or somebody with a bunch of letters behind their name, or Dr. So-and-so. But like, none of these may be true. They may be true, but they may also not be true. But when we make those assumptions, we aren't typically making them with the caveat that we could be wrong. We feel like automatically, well, you know what they are, they're just attention seeking. Rarely, if someone says they're just seeking attention, do they say, it's possible that they might just be seeking attention. They just say that's what it is, right? So try, and again, that could be what it is, although I would never call it just seeking attention, because if you have to cut yourself or believe that you do to get attention, there's something missing in that person's life that's pushing them to that part. And so ignoring their pleas for attention is about the worst thing that you can do. Intention matters when we are assessing, and I don't mean in a formal sense. I don't have an assessment tool that I use. I'm just talking about like meeting with, discussing with, and coming to some clarity about. When we're assessing how to respond to what we're dealing with self-injury, intentions really do matter. And so what we want to try and help them figure out, as well as ourselves, what is the function of this thing that you're doing? Because as Gabor Mate, who many of you are probably familiar with, says, you know, a weakness is an overdone strength. So anything that is hurting us, that is maladaptive, was once adaptive and served a purpose. He's known to say addiction is a solution to another problem, right? But we get confused and we think that addiction is the problem, and we focus all of our efforts on solving that problem instead of the problem that addiction is attempting to solve, and at times has solved, right? Made the pain go away or whatever. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about for the next little bit is trying to help that person and us figure out what is the function. Now, when I say commonly reported functions, people don't always, and this is putting it lightly, people don't always know why they do what they do. If I were to say it more authentically, I would say people hardly ever know why they do what they do. Our default state is reflexive because of this efficiency imperative in our biology. So to jump to conclusions, to make generalizations, to act reflexively, and then explain to ourselves after the fact, or as we're doing it, this is why I think I'm doing it, but I do it in such a way that I actually have tricked myself into thinking that that was a conscious decision that I made. So when I say commonly reported functions, if you're asking someone, so they come in and they've disclosed to you in some way, or you notice something, I'll just use cutting because it's the most ubiquitous. And they say, well, when I was upset last night, I cut myself. Okay. If we ask them, why do you think you did that? I would say these are the answers I get most frequently. I was numb and I needed to feel something, right? Or I felt like I deserved it, so I needed to punish myself. To feel alive, it might seem counterintuitive. You're hurting yourself to feel alive, right? Again, it comes out of that numbness place that it like gave me a thing to orient to. Not that they're going to use that language necessarily. But the most common one is, I don't know. And it's probably the most honest one. Not that they're being dishonest otherwise, but it's maybe not honest, maybe most self-aware, is to realize I actually don't know why I did that. I didn't plan on doing it, and I just started doing it. I didn't even know what happened. And it's like, yeah, that's probably very accurate. So when I'm talking about typical functions now, what I'm talking about is what's probably driving it, what may be driving it. And nowhere on my list does it say to punish yourself. It's like an obvious one. Oh, you're punishing but there's lots of ways of looking at it that it just doesn't add up, that's what's happening. So what we're looking at here is the functionality of self-injury, non-suicidal self-injury. Now, when I say here, I need to be punished, again, that's the mind's way of explaining what's happening. So let's say I did something, I feel really ashamed of it, and maybe part of me wants to die because I'm so ashamed of it. But I also know that that's not possible because it would devastate too many people that I care about, or maybe I just don't have the means, or I feel like I'm not brave enough. Well, hurting yourself is like the next best thing. So that's why I call it satiating the inner hate, right? Like there's a part of me saying, you need to pay for this. And so we can kind of like stave that part off by using self-injury in a way that doesn't have to lead to suicide. Now, it's kind of a mixed bag when you look at the research on non-suicidal self-injury and suicidality. If a person is engaging in NSSI, statistically, they are way more likely to attempt suicide. But it also has a strong relationship with suicide prevention. So when we're saying that it increases the likelihood of suicide attempts, that it's about who the control group is. It's right. It's about the comparison group as much as it's about the group who are injuring themselves. I hope that makes sense. It does in my brain, but things don't always come out the way I'm picturing them. Right. So an example would be if people with ADHD are 8 times more likely to commit suicide. So, wow, that's massive. Like, why aren't we doing something about that? Well, but it's like a 0.1% risk to a 0.8% risk. Like the absolute risk is still low. Proportionally, it's higher, but it's still low. It's not like people with ADHD are just running around committing suicide all the time, but it is a factor, right? So it's similarly with the non-suicidal self-injury. When we say it increases the likelihood, or it's associated with, it's correlated with increased numbers of suicide attempts, yes, within a certain population, but in the general public, it doesn't necessarily mean that. Because what we don't realize, because non-suicidal self-injury can come in so many forms, is that lots of people are doing it who have no intention of killing themselves. That person who comes home and has 6 beers instead of 4, they're not doing it because they want to die that night, but it's still a form of self-injury, right? So that those people aren't even included in the research, right, as a comparison group. This, even though it's not number 1 on my list, is probably the number 1 reason. And when we talk about people not knowing why they do something, this is a thing that a person, unless they had learned about the neurophysiology of their body, wouldn't know. Like most people, if you say, what are some of the neurotransmitters in your body? I don't know. Okay, I hear dopamine, endorphins, serotonin. What do they do? I don't know. Most people don't know that, right? And why would they? So when I talk about affect regulation, it's specifically affect, not emotion. Now, what I mean by that is that affect refers to the physiological, and emotion refers to the verbal, like the label that we give to the physiological. So if your nervous system's fired up when you're standing in line for the roller coaster, and when someone is putting a gun in your face and telling you to give you their wallet, but you wouldn't say that you're angry at the roller coaster. You're afraid of the roller coaster, right? But if someone, cuts you off in traffic or is disrespectful to you, you might find the same thing happening in your body, but it's not because necessarily you're afraid. You'd call that anger. So when I'm talking about affect regulation, I'm talking strictly biology here, not thoughts and meaning. So self-injury temporarily increases endorphin production. Now, endorphins are chemicals that our body makes that are painkillers. That's one of the main functions of endorphins. And endorphins kill all the pain, not just the physical pain. They also numb the emotional pain. So if I am experiencing emotional pain, I've just been broken up with, I feel really embarrassed about something, and I'm feeling the pain of that, which interestingly enough, we actually do feel physically. Endorphins, I could get them from other places, but if I punch the wall really hard right now, my brain will release endorphins to deal with the pain in my knuckles that will have a carryover effect on the emotional pain I'm feeling of loneliness. And it works like drugs, right? And it works real quick. Now, why would someone punch the wall if they can get endorphins in other places? So this is a disturbing picture of a rhesus monkey biting itself, what they call self-injurious behavior. They don't call it non-suicidal because they're like, well, we're assuming that it's not suicidal, but we can't actually ask them. So we're just going to call it self-injurious behavior. Now, look at this quote from this study. The most significant risk factor for this disorder, meaning self-injurious behavior of these rhesus monkeys, was maternal separation of infants at birth, followed by nursery rearing. In one study focusing on this specific factor, the ratio of nursery-reared monkeys to maternally reared monkeys that developed self-injurious behavior was 14:1. So you take these little baby monkeys, you take them from their mothers and their families, and you put them in a wire cage, and the likelihood of them engaging in self-injurious behavior is 14 times greater than in a monkey that's raised by its mother. Now, why is that? Because endorphins, along with being painkillers, are also the chemicals of attachment and love. So when you love somebody and you wrap your arms around them and give them a hug and they love you and you feel, that's endorphins. We might want to romanticize it and call it all sorts of other non-physical things, and maybe that's true as well, but it's also endorphins. To the point where if we do studies with animals where we block the endorphin receptors in their brain, they stop caring for their young because there's no reward for them to do it, no chemical payoff for it. You unblock them, they resume. So if I am feeling down and out, rejected, sad, what nature has designed is for me to be able to reach out to people that I love, who love me, and as a result, receive an influx of endorphins into my nervous system, which will soothe the pain that I'm feeling. But what if that is not an option for me, or I don't believe it's an option for me? What if the people I'm supposed to be able to get that from, I've never been able to get that from, or very inconsistently I'm able to get that from? The brain, in its attempt to be efficient, has a choice. Should I go with the short-term guaranteed source of endorphins, or should I go with the maybe source of, we're going to do the short-term one. So boom, I'm punching the wall. Because if I could, well, I'm going to reach out to my girlfriend and tell her how I'm feeling, but she might be too busy to answer the phone, and then I'm just going to make it worse. You know what? Just punch the wall. We're good. So this is, I would say, the number one thing. The number one function of non-suicidal self-injury is actually endorphin release as an attempt to deal with pain, emotional pain, and specifically, as I'll mention a little bit, specifically loneliness, isolation, disconnectedness, because endorphins that are released from self-injury, that's what's missing when we're feeling lonely and disconnected. And when we do it for a minute, we don't feel that anymore. I was talking with a client the other day. I was talking about how she was really overwhelmed by something that was happening in their life. It was a big, quite a big tragedy that had happened. She was feeling super overwhelmed. And she had a history when she was younger of making these kinds of I wouldn't say decisions, actions, reflexive actions. She saw a pair of scissors and she grabbed it and she just poof, drew a line on her leg with the scissors. And she said she instantly was like, oh, okay, now I know what to do. It was like the endorphins were released, blood flow returned to the cortex of her brain. She could now think clearly, and she went about her day. And like, she didn't keep doing it. It did that for her. It was essentially like taking an Ativan for her. So again, if a person is using non-suicidal self-injury for something like that, and we remove that from them without a replacement, we've left them exposed without a coping response. And so if we're really focused on, you got to stop doing that thing that's hurting you, like there's going to be an inner resistance to taking the shield off, understandably, right? Another function of self-injury is communication. When we talk about behavior always is a form of communication. We tend to think of communication as like telling something to someone, but it also includes asking questions. And so this self-injurious behavior is both telling us something about that person or ourselves and asking us something. So what it's most commonly telling us is, I'm alone. I feel alone. I'm lonely, lost, sad, all of those. That's what that means. It's so important to recognize that in terms of our health, especially long-term health, suppression of emotion is a carcinogen. It will ruin our bodies and take years off your lifespan. Suppressing emotion is not good for your body, which means that if someone is expressing emotion through self-injury in the form of pinching themselves really hard or biting them or punching a wall, it's actually healthier in the long run than holding it in. It sounds counterintuitive, but it is. There's lots of research that shows that. So if we're thinking about this behavior is telling me something, it might not be telling it in a way that I would like it to tell me, but it is telling me, and it's better that it tells me than they don't tell me. The questions that the behavior is asking of us are typically these questions. Again, the person might not know that. They might not have thought, I want to see if I matter to this person, so I'm going to hurt myself and see how they respond. But there's lots of ways of sort of discerning that is often what's happening. Now, the statements before, I'm alone, I'm lost, I'm disconnected, and these questions, do I matter? Do you care? Will you connect? They're all questions about attachment, right? Attachment trauma is at the root of self-injurious behavior, non-suicidal self-injurious behavior. And it's an attempt to cope with the complex trauma of attachment trauma. Like I feel confident in saying that's always what it is. And we don't typically use absolutisms like that, but I would sort of say, like, find me an exception to that. And I would give you $1 million if I had it. So always come in with a baseline, if not assumption, awareness that this is probably where this is coming from, even if it doesn't really look like that on the surface. Now, how we respond when we're talking about this with people, it's really important to remember this. This is again, it's an absolute statement that I would stand behind. You cannot build trust with someone while trying to control them. When you're taking power away from somebody else, they won't trust you, right? It's just a fact. So why is this relevant? Because if I'm saying to someone, I need you to sign this contract that says that you're not going to do this thing, otherwise I have to refer you or report you, I'm taking control away from them. And now I'm expecting them to be open with me and talking about what's going, they're not going to, they might not even come back, right? And so that's why it's important for us to have a lens of, I might not need to go that route. I might, but I also might not. And so trying to take control of a situation like that is actually our last resort, not our first one. It's if nothing else will do, then we have to go to that place. Another function of self-injury is, as I said earlier, fitting into the group, which again, it's an attachment thing, right? That we experience separation anxiety when we're not a part of the group. So if all of my friends are doing this and I'm not, I'm now outside of the group, even though the thing that they're doing puts them outside the bigger group, it puts them inside the smaller group. And if I don't join, I'm not part of the bigger group or the smaller group. I have no group. So I'm going to do the thing that they're doing, right? So it's one of the things that when I'm working with someone and they're talking about self-injury, I will often ask, like, do you know anybody else who does this? Or how did you learn about it, especially with younger kids? Where did you get the idea first? Well, my friend did it, and my other friend did it. Okay, and that's starting to tell me a little bit more of the picture of this might not be, out of self-loathing. It's about belonging, which in itself is related to attachment trauma, right? Because if I'm willing to hurt myself to fit in, that tells me about the level of desperation I feel to fit in, or more accurately, the level of fear I have about not fitting in, right? It's always going to come back to attachment. One of my other presentations on attachment is called The Answer to Everything, because it just actually is. Find me something that's not rooted in attachment trauma or security. So I realize I'm going through this really fast. Apologize for the fire hose approach, but that's what we're limited to. At the end, I'll put my contact information. If you have questions, you can send me an email or contact me on social media in some way. I want to talk about managing risk, because it's real important. When it comes to adults, I looked it up. Now, I'm a registered clinical counselor with BC Association of Clinical Counselors. I don't know if many of you are. If you're not, look up your organization's sort of governing rules and ethics guidelines. For us as RCCs, when it's a child, it says you need to report. It's a very low threshold, but it's not actually quite that black and white in practice. When it's an adult, there is actually no legal duty to report. Now, you might feel a personal moral duty to do that, but don't mistake that for a professional legal duty to report. Because if we're going to report, we have to take into consideration all of the possible outcomes of reporting and not reporting, right? Now, that's hard to do, so I've simplified it. Things to consider when deciding whether to report. Above everything else is immediate safety. Now, it doesn't say immediate well-being. It says safety, as in, is the thing going to kill them? Not hurt them, kill them, right? That's the threshold that I'm operating on. So, for example, and this made a bit of a side, and there probably are people who make the legalization of ethics their life who wouldn't like me to say it, but if someone tells me that they're going to commit suicide on July 1st and it's now March 22nd, I'm not reporting that. That's a long time from now. And if I rush to report, that might be the last conversation I have with that person, or that anyone has with them, because they're not going to trust anybody anymore, right? So that's what I'm talking about, immediate safety. If they say, I'm going to go home today and do it, or tomorrow morning, then we're acting on that. But again, that's suicide. If someone comes in and they say, yeah, I've been cutting a lot, okay, I'll ask them all sorts of questions about it. And if I determine that this is a habitual thing and that they're not doing it in a way where they might accidentally do something serious, then we just carry on as if they just told me that they had too much to drink last night. And we try to understand it better. If they're doing it in a way that is risky or increasingly risky, then we have to have a conversation about what I do from there. Now, in the everything else box I would say under the big umbrella is reporting what is the impact it will have on helping. So there's my relationship personally with that person as someone who's working with them. Will they not trust me anymore? Will that, get in the way of me being able to help them? If I feel the need to report, but it's not like to the hospital or the police, but like to, say, their mother, how's that going to impact the relationship with the mother, right? Is mom going to handle that in a helping way, or are they going to overreact or shame or whatever? Because that is important to take into consideration. And even bigger to me is the trust in the helpers, not just me, but will this, I've worked with many kids and youth, and the only reason they're in my office is because they're mandated to be, and their previous experiences with counseling just wrote counseling off for them because the counselor talked to mom and dad about something. And so it was like, what's the point? I can't talk about anything, right? So reporting is the last resort, right? Unless there is an immediate safety, like to their life, that we need to take into consideration. So I'm talking about non-suicidal self-injury, but again, not all self-injury is non-suicidal. For some people, it might actually be part of an escalating pattern, and that's why we do the assessment. But this Venn diagram, sort of like assessment and treatment, are not separate. How we assess is part of the treatment, right? So if I'm assessing in a cold, judgmental, clinical way, that is affecting the problem that I'm trying to help, right? But if I respond with compassion and understanding and calm, as that is part of the treatment, even though I'm actually just asking questions and assessing, it is part of helping, right? So it's an important thing to remember. And that's why we kind of have to figure out our own stuff, because let's say this kind of thing really triggers me because of my own personal past or people that I know of or my own cultural norms. I gotta figure that out before I end up in a room with someone gasping, or shaking my head in disapproval, which things happen very reflexively, right? Because that's affecting how we're going to be able to help this person. So Gabor Mate, his approach, he calls compassionate inquiry, right? Mine's a little funkier. It's called ABBA, which stands for always begin by asking, right? So what I mean by this, we go back to this idea of like cultural norms and cultural constructs. They're all built on assumptions, right? And so when we begin by asking, we're acknowledging that I do have assumptions and that they are assumptions, and I'm curious about whether or not they're accurate. So I can only know that by asking questions, right? So, for example, my ADHD, I'm often looking for my keys as I'm heading out the door. And my wife says, if you hang the keys on the hook every time, then you wouldn't have to look for them every time. Now, I could respond to it by saying, I know that. And sometimes I do. But what I said to her was, I'm curious. Now, I'm actually curious, and that's not a facetious question. I'm curious. Are you under the impression that I disagree with that? She's like, what do you mean? I said, do you think that I don't think that's a good idea to hang them in the same place every time? She's like, well, no. I'm like, well, then why are you telling me again? It's like you're telling me to convince me of the thing, but I agree with you. That's not why I don't do it. Why do you think? I'm not telling her why I don't do it. I'm saying, why do you think I don't do it? Well, you probably just forget. Yeah, that's right. That's much more effective than me telling her that's why. She figured it out for herself. That's going to stick in a lot more, right? So when we're assessing this non-suicidal, we want to be curious. And it's really hard to fake curiosity. Just throwing the word curious in doesn't make us curious. So try and actually be curious, right? And if you're having a hard time with it, I would suggest being transparent about that. I'm trying hard to be curious about this. There's parts of me that are not curious. I'm trying to keep them quieter so that I can be curious. And the more I'm saying that, I'm reminding myself to just try and be curious here. Assume you don't know anything and just ask some questions. And it's creating mindfulness about my own assumptions and their assumptions. And it facilitates mindfulness in the client or the person that we're helping, right? So I get a kid meeting with, and he threw a rock through the school window. Like, for me to say, if you keep doing that, when you're an adult, that's actually like a criminal charge and you'll go to jail. Like, he's gonna be like, oh, really? I won't do it. Like, that doesn't happen, right? Instead, I'll say, so I'm curious, when you picked up the rock, between the time that you thought about throwing it and the time that you threw it, was there any kind of internal conversation about whether or not that was a good idea? Like, I'm actually curious. I don't know if there was or not. Well, yeah, I said, oh, what was that conversation like? Now, that's not just helping me understand, it's helping them understand what went into doing that. Now, take the rock throwing through the window and replace it with some form of self-injury. So you said last night it was late and you're by yourself and you're feeling sad, and then you did X, Y, and Z. You hurt yourself in some way. I'm curious, like, was there an inner conversation about that? Or did it just happen sort of reflexively, and then afterwards you kind of realized what you'd done? Or I was curious about that. And it gives them the opportunity to be like, let me think about that, which normally is not happening because they're just too busy feeling ashamed for it, right? And I'm curious about the thing, which helps them to be curious about it and be more mindful of it. So these are some of the sort of specific kind of questions I'm asking. Like, when do you do it? Like, what time of day, week, month, year? Temporal triggers, meaning like, is it around certain events? Is it like every evening at 9:30, I get the feeling coming over me? Okay, because that might actually just be a conditioned response from previous experiences, and that some days you just do it on autopilot, not because you're even feeling bad, but because 9:30 is the time that your body says, oh, isn't that the time that we hurt ourselves? Let's do it. And it's autopilot. So again, asking about when. Where do you do it? Right now, where on the body, but also like out in the world. Like, do you do it in the closet or do you do it in your history class? Right? Because that says two different things. Maybe the kid doing it in history class wants to be noticed that he's doing it. The kid doing it in the closet doesn't. That's telling us a little bit about the function of the action, right? So if you take this person's body here, and these are all the potential places that a person could inflict an injury on themselves. To me, again, this is not empirically tested other than from, 17 years of practice. If I'm hurting myself, wounding myself in a way that's easily visible to others, then there is probably some form of please notice me happening. I'm not calling it attention seeking. I'm calling it please notice me, right? The first time I did it for myself, it cut this little thing in my arm. Again, it was in the family room of my house. People were like walking around. I think my mom was like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm just carving this thing in. And that was the end of that conversation. Right. But like, there was like a little Teddy in there going like, Mom, did you notice that I'm bleeding from my arm in your house? Come and like love me. No, my mom was a lovely person, but she had 7 kids. So she was probably just happy that I wasn't setting anything on fire that would hurt someone else. And that's not even a joke. It probably was actually that. But also, like, if I'm cutting on my arm, am I cutting on the back of my arm? Or am I cutting on the inside of my arm? Am I cutting down by my wrist? Am I cutting horizontally, vertically? Like, all of these things matter. If someone says, well, no, I always cut here because they've done some research on this. That tells me they're mindful about it, as opposed to an impulsive, I gotta do this to myself. It's like, no, I always make sure I do it here, right? So the location on the body is important, and as well as physical location, like I said, and what method. So like, person's cutting or burning or pinching or biting or hitting. I'm not saying why, right? Because that sometimes is like a kind of question. We're like, why? How come you use that method instead of another one, for example? Or I might give them a thought experiment. Let's say you had the opportunity to, cut yourself or burn yourself. Which would you choose? Cutting, probably. Oh, I'm curious why you would pick that one over the other one. Again, this is just about increasing and facilitating mindfulness in them. the reason we have to do this kind of assessment is because there are two underlying risks that are always there, even if the intention is emotion regulation, affect regulation. And that is, one of them is death, because accidents happen. People cut a little bit too deep one time and they're like, oh shit, I gotta go. And addiction, because pain is a drug, right? The endorphins specifically are the drug. And even though my intention initially might be affect regulation, just like the first time I smoke weed or use meth, it can develop a dependence on that thing, where now I'm just doing the thing because you have to do the thing to feel okay, and not because I'm in any kind of external distress. So when I'm talking with people, I'm seeing like, the reason why I'm taking it seriously is not because it's a terrible thing that you're doing, or because you are going to die necessarily, but like, you can get dependent on this kind of thing, and then it can kind of get away from you, and then it becomes its own problem, right? So that's why so part of the assessment is seeing it in context. We talk about cultural context. This is like in the context of their life. So is it just an isolated incident, or is it part of a bigger pattern, right? Now, this is my own little chart that I came up with in terms of assessing, like, where are we, right? So let's say you've been working with this person for a while, and this is not the first time they did it. The first stage here is like escalating, right? So they did it maybe 3 months ago, and then a month later, and then 2 weeks after that, and then 1 week after that. Okay, so we're escalating, right? If I have a sample size with this person, I might find that they're at the second stage, which is like, this is the most they've ever done. This is the highest frequency, and it's like serious. Or let's say I've been working with them for a while, and they come in and they say, well, I did it again, but it was happening every 3 days, and this was like 15 days. Okay, so we're de-escalating, we're reducing the frequency, we're on the downside of that slope. Now, this is an important one, because if you look at the absolute value of 3 and 4, they don't look that different, but they can mean very different things depending on which side of the slope they're on, right? So they might say, well, yeah, I did it, but it's been like 3 weeks, so I wouldn't call it like a big deal. It's like, okay, but before that it had been 4 months, so that does seem actually like an escalation, that we're heading back up. And the comparative peak is, it's not just that this is more frequently than recently. It's, how does this peak compare to previous peaks? Is it overall increasing, or is it overall decreasing? Because when you're trying to work through something that you're dependent on, a coping mechanism, it's not going to be linear. There's going to be up, down, 2 steps forward, 1 back, 3 forward, 5 back. That's just how it is. But in terms of the whole pattern, is it a downward slope, or is it an upward slope? That's kind of what we need to pay attention to.
Ted, I'm just going to quickly interrupt, just
Sure.
in case anyone has to leave right at 3. I've put the PDF I was talking about, with the excellent article Ted wrote, in the chat, and I've also put a link for a really short webinar evaluation. So I just wanted to point that out in case anyone has to leave right on the nose, but we're happy to carry on. Yeah.
This is my last slide. The fire hose, we're getting it in there. So hopefully it's recorded. You can go back and listen again. This is something that when I supervise student counselors, interns, and this is the thing that I'm trying to get through to them, like from the beginning. This is what helping looks like. It is a constant rotation through this triangle. We are assessing the situation based on our understanding, our own filters. From those assessments, we draw some tentative conclusions and intervene in some way. We then evaluate how the intervention is impacting, and based on the evaluation, we reassess. And if we go back to the idea that how we assess is part of the treatment, it's really important, right? Because assessment can be intervention. How I'm assessing can be the most effective intervention. When someone comes in and says, I have something to tell you, and I'm just so ashamed of it. And I say, okay, what is it? and I'm saying it in a calm, comforting, safe way, I've already started the treatment. Instead of like, well, what? Right? That's a very different kind of assessment, right? And even the evaluation, let's say I've determined in my assessment that this intervention is helpful, and it doesn't seem to be helpful. If my evaluation is what are they doing wrong, then that's probably going to make me less effective as a helper, as opposed to what did we miss in the process? We must have missed something that would allow this to be more helpful, right? Or maybe I'm barking up the wrong tree here. So that's all the info that I could fit in an hour and a half. But yes, I'm more than happy to stick around and take questions if people have questions.
Thank you. It was really interesting, really informative. Anyone want to have a few questions? He's willing to stick around.
Go ahead. You can throw it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself, I think, and ask it.
Then this is us finishing right on time. And I really do want to thank you, Ted. Like it was an excellent webinar. And there's some comments coming into the chat now saying it's informative. And
so I was going to put a thank you for the opportunity. It's the first time I've presented on this specifically with this much time and attention to it. It's usually just sort of thrown into other things. So I appreciate the opportunity. This is how you can contact me outside of here if you want to, if you have questions or comments or whatever. My Instagram and Facebook page, and then you can, wait, that's not my email, that's my website. My email is ted@connectivitycounseling.com, or there's a contact form on my website, although you might end up in my spam folder along with all of the hot singles in my area who apparently want to chat. A lot of them.
yeah, check out the chat, Ted, because they're showing you some love.
Okay. Well, thanks.
And as someone said, you really shed a lot of light on the subject. And I just really, really, really appreciate your approach. I really do. I think that even if I took one thing away from this, which I'm taking a lot more than that, that would be the first thing.
And so what would you call that first thing, the approach? Like if you were going to say it's this approach, what would you say?
Well, there's two things, non-judgmental and caring.
It's funny, because I took an hour and a half to say it.
Sorry. I just really didn't see this webinar going that way, and I learned so much today. I really want to thank you. That was so informative.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that was really good, Ted. Yeah.
Thank you.
I thought so.
It's one of those things where your own lived experience, informs, right? Because it's like, as a clinical supervisor, I sort of lend myself to this. It's called the person of the therapist model, right? Which is the wounded healer, which is not leave your stuff at the door. It's like use your stuff to connect, not in a like the patient, the counselor, or the client is my therapist way, but like me too can be very validating, and that can be treatment in a nutshell, right? Like, yeah, I remember the first time because I was taught like don't talk about yourself. I remember this kid sitting across from me struggling with addiction and all of the same stuff that I'd struggled with in my life, and I just had this strong feeling like you can't not say something. And so I said to him, it wasn't that long ago I was sitting in your chair having your part of the conversation, and you could just see him like, oh, okay, and now you're in that chair, and like that was where things kind of broke open, right? It's just that's where that parallel process is so important. But I appreciate the kind words, everybody.
Hey, Ted, I have a quick question. And
Okay.
thank you again for everything that you share with us today. I resonate with everyone else. I really love this webinar. I think it's my first time hearing the word slow motion injury. I'm wondering if there's any, like, if I want to read up more about it, is there any, on top of your head, any resources or places I can go to kind of read a little bit more about that?
None off the top of my head, because it's more just from my clinical experience. I think the closest thing that you might find, and the word that I use for it, that might not be the one, is peri-suicidal, right? As in PERI, peri-suicidal. In that, like, you might have a client who's not suicidal, but they don't care if they die, right? And so, like, working with addicts who don't even check the dose, as opposed to intentionally getting too much, then it's like, yeah, give it to me. If I die, I die, right? And so that's kind of under that same umbrella of a slow motion injury. It's sort of like, it's almost like a passive aggressive injury that, like, so like exercise could be one of those things, right? Like, I know if I keep pushing it this hard, I'm going to end up with tendonitis, but I'm going to do that anyway because part of me actually just wants to have tendonitis. But it's easy to hide that under the umbrella of, oh, I was just working too hard, instead of part of me wanted the pain, right? Maybe you can do the research on it for us, Alice, and let us know.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you so much, Ted.
Any last comments or questions before we let everyone go?
Sorry, I just wanted to quickly say that someone put in the comments about this was a good webinar for their children. And I thought that was a nice comment, Ted, because sometimes you don't think about it, that, like, yes, we can talk to our children about this too. And again, I didn't know where you were going with this webinar. It was so good. And I really appreciated that comment and your webinar. So thank you.
Thank you.
Well, and on that note, I will thank you again, Ted,
Okay.
and I will thank everyone for attending, and it will eventually be up on our website. And I really appreciated and enjoyed all of this.